Hello and welcome to our open Q&A webinar with Dr. Ethan Russo. We're thrilled that you guys are here. We're looking forward to the questions that you guys have for us, and just want to take a moment to tell you how this is all going to work. I'm Nisha Whiteley. I'm the COO of Credo Science and have the pleasure of being business partners with Dr. Ethan Russo, who is going to be answering your questions today. And if you'll look on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. And so please put your questions there. I may not answer them or may not bring them up in order as they are presented. We'll do our very best to get to everyone's questions, but we only have an hour. So let's go ahead and fire away in the Q&A section. And I'm going to take a moment just to point out that we're going to be sharing some resources with you guys in the chat, not in the Q&A section, but in the chat. And want to alert you to our website, Credo Science, or credo-science.com. We have some information in there about upcoming events. And if you click on the shop tab, you'll be able to see previous webinars that are available. Also, we'll be talking about website, ethanrusso.org, that has all of the writings that Ethan has been working on, or most of them. It's a phenomenal resource for anybody who is curious about cannabis or the endocannabinoid system. And as we go through, we'll be sharing other resources in the chat as well. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Ethan Russo. Ethan.
Thanks. Well, welcome everyone. I am really appreciative of your appearing today at this busy time of year, but we thought we'd offer this Q&A session as a holiday gift to people. I realize that a lot of content often requires getting through a paywall. Couple of things. We're happy to answer clinical questions. What we will not be doing is talking about particular cases. Rather, we'll be talking about conditions in general. Essentially, we're not treating your condition specifically, but we may be addressing conditions of interest. So with that in mind, if we have questions ready, let's begin.
All right, so I'm going to combine two questions here. The first part is, what CBD dose do you recommend for insomnia, especially for people who don't want THC? And then I'm going to circle back to another one, and I think you can answer these two together. So this person writes, "Hi, Dr. Russo. I work as a functional nutritionist, and most of my work is centered around the impact of epigenetics on methylation and detoxification, and two very common conditions that my patients experience are mast cell activation syndrome, MCAS, and a history of trauma. I've had great success using doses of CBG at 15 to 25 mg 1 to 3 times per day with patients who have MCAS that might show up as neuropathy, migraines, or other symptoms of high histamine. Though I haven't seen a lot of research on CBG for MCAS, is there a strong binding affinity of CBG to mast cells, or is there another mechanism at play here?" And then they follow up with, "As for trauma, do you think CBC would be helpful for patients with working neural reprogramming and to help stop the cell danger response? How would this work differently than CBD or THC?" So
there's 3 questions there.
Exactly.
All right, let's go in reverse order. CBC, cannabichromene. This is the least available of the common cannabinoids. The reason being that it's synthesized by a recessive gene in comparison to THC and CBD, which are functions of codominant genes. We really know less about the pharmacology of cannabichromene. It clearly is good for inflammatory conditions. And it's shown some benefits in psychiatric conditions, at least in test animals. But because it's not commonly available and it's never been the subject of any randomized controlled trials, we really have a lot less to say. So this is a situation to watch this space. Yes, I think cannabichromene is a very important future therapeutic agent. We're doing our best to selectively breed for it, but it's going to take some time. So that's about the best I can do there. Cannabigerol, a subject dear to our hearts. One of our articles published last year is in that library where you saw the link. So at ethanrusso.org/library. If you look up cannabigerol, you'll see a paper there where we did a survey of people using CBG, at least 50% CBG preparations, and 127 people responded. And there was a wide variety of conditions that where they found benefit. And it was really illuminating because the degree of improvement was really great. Specifically, there was no instance where someone thought that so-called conventional medicine was working better than cannabigerol for their particular condition. And it ran the range. There were many pain conditions, but particularly depression, anxiety, and sleep were benefited. So this is a very versatile agent. Wasn't associated with side effects to speak of, and no withdrawal effects. So I really couldn't say more about the specific condition that was the subject of the question. But if you ask me if I'm surprised that you'd see benefit with it, no, I'm not surprised at all, because again, this is turning out to be very helpful in a wide variety of conditions. Let's see, the first one was on dosing of CBD, I believe. You're really taxing an old man's memory here. So let's go through.
For insomnia, Ethan.
Yeah, you bet. What I'm going to say is going to surprise you. CBD is really not an agent for sleep per se. Okay, let me explain though. CBD is included in a bunch of sleep preparations, but it's not a drug that is a hypnotic. It's not something that makes people sleep. It may be helpful in situations, particularly where there's anxiety, where treating it will allow someone to sleep. So at low and moderate doses, CBD is actually activating. I have friends in California that use doses of CBD, pure CBD, instead of caffeine in the morning to help them wake up. At extremely high doses, particularly in association with polypharmacy, in other words, combined with other drugs, it can be sedating. And the most notorious example is in kids with Dravet or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome that might be taking Epidiolex, prescription form cannabidiol, in conjunction with other medicines, particularly clobazam, benzodiazepine, that is extremely sedating. And what happens at extremely high doses is there's a drug-drug interaction, and there's a buildup of a breakdown product of clobazam called N-desmethylclobazam, which is extremely sedating. So the solution there is not to get rid of the CBD, but reduce the dose of clobazam. Going back to dosing of CBD and for sleep, I'd say that low dosing, but again, if it's just CBD, I wouldn't expect too much. It's going to need other things like an extremely low dose of THC, and particularly terpenoids that would help sleep, particularly linalool, which is also anti-anxiety, and myrcene, which is sedating. So those things could help. Dosing on CBD in general is quite different to THC. The numbers of milligrams needed, if it is just CBD, are considerably higher. So if we have a tiny amount of THC, and someone's treating anxiety or to help sleep, they might need quite a bit more CBD, 20, 40 milligrams. To treat anxiety on its own in experiments, as much as 300 or 400 milligrams of pure CBD was needed. I like to say that there's nothing that CBD does that won't be enhanced by having a little bit of THC aboard. And circling back to CBG, the dosing there is a great deal lower. For example, in treating anxiety or most conditions with CBG, we're finding that doses in the range of 5 milligrams on the low side to 20 milligrams on the high side are usually plenty. That's per dose. So numbers needed for CBG are a great deal lower than for CBD.
Great, thank you. We have a question about high dose CBD, saying that they're seeing products that have 200 milligrams of CBD per capsule, and have heard certain cancer patients may take upwards of 7,000 milligrams a day to put cancer into remission or help keep it in remission. And the specific question is, do you think that high dose of CBD can help with forgetfulness?
I don't know why a high dose would be necessary for forgetfulness. In terms of, again, pure CBD, usually people feel a little sharper, and that can be on lower doses. So 10 to 40 milligrams. The 7,000 milligrams of CBD is going to break the budget for anyone. I can't imagine why that's necessary for any condition, including cancer. Speaking generally, in primary treatment of cancer, in other words, using cannabinoids to treat a tumor so that it will shrink or disappear, we're often talking about 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day of mixed cannabinoids. And it's almost always the case that some combination of cannabinoids is going to work better than one alone. The situation where people would use high or super high doses of CBD probably comes about because of an inability to tolerate higher doses of THC. However, I'd point out that with a very slow titration, upward dosing of THC, people can get used to it and tolerate some of these extremely high doses that, for somebody who wasn't used to it, the naive user would be enough to make them crazy, temporarily, of course. What's surprising is there's certain tumors that are more responsive to cannabinoids. So there was a study that was published a couple of years ago now, looking at Sativex or nabiximols, which is essentially a one-to-one combination of THC and CBD. And at conventional doses, up to 12 sprays a day, which would be 32.4 milligrams of THC and 30 milligrams of CBD, there was a prominent response in the severe brain tumor called glioblastoma multiforme, GBM. So that was a bit of a surprise because, again, most cancers require these higher doses.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to switch gears just a little bit. You've written about the use of cannabis roots, identifying 2 triterpenoids. What are the best solvents to use to make topicals? Water, alcohol, oil?
Well, you have to look at the solubility. So the root ingredients are really different than what's in the flowers. In the flowers, we're primarily interested in cannabinoids and terpenoids. They're highly lipophilic, and they require a solvent like an oil or ethanol or liquid CO2. With the roots, a lot of these things are triterpenoids, which are going to be relatively insoluble, or even low concentrations of alkaloids. I think either could work. In the past, we've seen references to teas made with the roots, so that would be just an aqueous solution. But also, probably it's a situation that a hydroalcoholic solvent would be best. So, a good approach when in doubt with any botanical is to do a combination. For example, when I make my herbal bitters, a lot of the recipes call for an initial ethanol extraction using like Everclear or a high potency other spirit like vodka. And that's followed by time boiling it to get out any remaining water soluble agents. So I think that, again, particularly for homemade remedies, a little experimentation is in order. My suspicion is that either would work, but again, the combination alcohol and water is going to be best. In general, in doing herbal preparations, often a good recipe is a 5-to-1 ratio. So 5 amounts of alcohol, and that in this instance, if you want to do both together, you could use like 100 proof vodka and 5 times the amount of whatever the weight is of the herbal material.
Thank you. Our next question is about flavonoids. Do you have any insight into their therapeutic potential?
Whoa, that's a good one. Was that a plant?
Did not plan it.
Okay. Well, we're extremely interested at Credo Science in the therapeutic potential of cannabis-based flavonoids, specifically a group of molecules called the canflavins. So first, what are flavonoids? So these are colored agents that give plant parts a lot of their vibrant colors, particularly berries. So things that are yellow or red or purple, sometimes white, but those colors in particular, often due to flavonoids. As it turns out, about 30 years ago now, erstwhile colleague of mine, Marilyn Barrett, discovered something called canflavin A in cannabis, and it turned out to be a very strong anti-inflammatory with a potency somewhere between aspirin and corticosteroids. Fast forward to 2014, and a bunch more work was done by Wirtz et al. In Europe on this, and they found out that canflavin A has a really interesting anti-inflammatory profile. So it doesn't affect the COX enzymes. So most anti-inflammatories, the non-steroidals, are what are called COX inhibitors. So those can be effective at treating inflammation and pain, but they come with a bad side effect profile in terms of risks of gastrointestinal bleeding, ulcers, heart attacks, and strokes. So having an anti-inflammatory agent that doesn't have that liability has been sort of a holy grail in therapeutics. What was found was that canflavins didn't affect the COX enzymes, but did affect the lipoxygenase system and other prostaglandin-related inflammatory mechanisms. So it affected 2 of the major pathways having to do with inflammation, but not with COX inhibition. So the future looks very bright. And this may have a lot of different applications in treating pain, treating arthritis, treating various types of cancers. We are engaged in research with a company in Canada called Canurta, Canurta, that's very involved in this. And we're hoping that that is going to translate into a variety of different echelons of products, starting with what we call activated hemp seed meal. In fact, sprouts of cannabis seed produce canflavins before they even get around to making cannabinoids. So that's one echelon. Next would be supplements that would presumably contain a higher concentration of canflavins. They're now canflavin A, B, and C, closely related molecules. And ultimately, there may be a reason for pharmaceutical development of higher dose canflavin products. Normally, these are present in small concentrations in the plant, but it may be that even small doses are helpful. So even on a nutritional level, this may be something that is worth people doing, hopefully in the near future.
Thank you. What do you recommend for neuropathy, both in the hands and the feet, as well as restless leg syndrome?
Sure. Well, two different conditions that may overlap. Restless leg syndrome is a movement disorder. All the movement disorders are hard to treat. There are lots of things that have been tried for it, but a lot of people get benefit from cannabis, and it should probably contain some small amount of THC. CBD can be helpful. I don't think that CBD on its own likely would be helpful. With neuropathy, this is a condition in which there is damage to the nerves. It's most common in relation to diabetes. However, there are 100 other causes. It's a very hard thing to treat. Conventionally, a lot of things have tried, particularly the tricyclic antidepressants, which can be effective, but they're extremely sedating and produce constipation and a bunch of other issues. And then a bunch of anticonvulsants are tried, but bottom line is people who have this cycle through many different medicines, often without good relief and with a lot of side effects. Cannabis can be extremely helpful in treating neuropathic pain, nerve-based pain. But like any of these medicines, it's going to a certain extent be a hit or miss proposition. Again, THC seems to be a necessary ingredient, but CBD can be an adjunct to it. CBD on its own will produce a response in a small percentage of patients, and it's not a direction where I suggest that people start there. CBG may be helpful. It's got other independent mechanisms in treating pain. Again, we just find CBG appearing as helpful in a wide variety of conditions. Again, experimentation is necessary to establish what kind of preparation is going to be best for a given individual and how much. And again, I would just emphasize that the adage is start low and go slow. It's very important that people be able to tolerate the medicine, because once they have a bad experience, a possibly helpful medicine may be lost to them if they get scared. So we want to avoid that at all costs. Something I've always told my patients is, you have this chronic condition. We want you to get better, but we want you to get better slowly without producing problems from the medicine. So that's a good way to look at cannabis-based treatment as well.
Thank you. Can you talk about CBG and osteoporosis?
Well, I guess the big question is, well, there are two aspects. One is treating symptoms associated with osteoporosis, which would be pain. And there may be a role there. Does CBG treat osteoporosis itself? The answer is I don't know. That's possible. Switching to a relative, we know that CBD does enhance wound fracture healing. And there are other cannabinoids and endocannabinoids that increase bone density. So a lot of work has been done on on this in Israel. If you look up publications by Itai Bob, B-A-B, the late Israeli scientist, this was his big thing. But Professor Meshulam has looked at this extensively. So these have to do with the so-called anabolic effect of cannabinoids, building up, in this instance, trying to reverse the breakdown of bone, the osteoclasis, and increase the osteogenesis. So it's not a situation where I can say this specific group of cannabinoids or this dose is going to help. It's too early in the game for that. So the bottom line is, I think there's a role here for treatment of osteoporosis, cannabis-based medicines. We just can't be very specific.
Thank you. Our next question is going in a completely different direction. I did not plant this. I didn't pay anybody to ask this question, so here it is. Will there be home or commercial units of a cryo-keef device for sale in the near future? And do you have a timeline on that? Also, are there any states with licensed facilities making cryo-keef for sale in the US or Canada? And what is cryo-keef?
Okay, well, yeah, let's start there. So cryo-keef is the trademark name that we put on a process that was, again, published last year. And this is available in an article at ethanrusso.org/library. So cryo, in this instance with a K, so it's Kryo, Kryo-Keef, Kief. So let's break that down. Cryo means cold. Keef is a name for a sifted kind of hashish in Morocco. So we adopted that name for this process. And what it is a process that was born out of the idea that we're losing a lot of content, particularly terpenoids, with current techniques of cannabis extraction. So people are probably familiar with the idea that cannabis is grown and then it's dried and cured. And then people may use the flower, or they may then extract the dried buds. But along the way, this has been shown, we've known this for at least 25 years, you lose 40 or even 50% of the lower molecular weight terpenoids by this drying and curing process. Now, there's some people that have different techniques of doing it, so the loss may not be as great. However, we were interested in trying to preserve the profile that the plant makes when it's fresh, so the day it's picked, what is in it and how can we preserve that? So the idea was keep it cool. So the process involved harvesting the plants and immediately exposing them to vapor of dry ice. Dry ice, of course, is a solid form of carbon dioxide. And in exposing the flowers to this over a period of time, the trichomes, where the cannabinoids and terpenoids are produced, become brittle, and then they're subject to falling off. So following this in a freezer, we used a rotating drum to sift out the trichomes. What we were able to do in the process was essentially triple or thereabouts the cannabinoid content and preserving the monoterpenoid content. So we did a lot of analysis of the fresh plant and how things differed every step of the way. But essentially, we ended up with a sifted hash that could contain as much as 60% cannabinoids and very high amounts of terpenoids, again, doubling or tripling in some instances as compared to what was in the fresh flower. So what would you do with this stuff? Well, a couple of totally different things. This kind of material would have appeal to the high-end cannabis connoisseur. But more importantly, we were interested in this as an initial technique for extraction of cannabinoids and terpenoids for the pharmaceutical approaches, particularly ones that would leverage the acid cannabinoids, because the whole process is under cold exposure. You're not getting the decarboxylation of the cannabinoid acids. However, that material then could be subjected to heat to decarboxylate. But again, we're finding these combinations of cannabinoids, combining the neutral cannabinoids with the acid cannabinoids that the plant makes when it's fresh, are particularly helpful. So trying to create that versatility in what you can get out of the preparation. Back to the question, this isn't commercially available. However, in the publication, certainly someone could do it on their own the way we did with a small amount of equipment. We're not talking super high tech. We do plan to try and commercialize this and also develop hardware to basically make the technique easier. So simultaneously freezing and spinning the material. Here's the commercial plug. We're interested in partners that would help develop this. We feel strongly that this is going to be an important technique that has advantages over, say, supercritical CO2 extraction, which is notorious for, well, the way it's conventionally done is notorious for producing wastage of terpenoid content. So if you believe that terpenoids are important to therapeutic properties of cannabis, keeping it cool is one approach to their preservation.
Thank you. Can you speak to the dangers of heating and inhaling of mold spores or mycotoxins, as well as heavy metals and other compounds for individuals that may be found on some cannabis products? And could you also speak to any credible studies that prove absorbing these substances through the lungs is harmful? And then if you could address, is there a benefit to irradiation of cannabis, and how does that impact quality?
Yeah, well, I'm going to point you to papers again. Let's see. There's a paper in the library, current, how does it go? Well, I think it's current cannabis controversies. Those names are in the title. It was a few years ago. It's why the exact title slips my mind. It addresses all these things. So to go one at a time. Unfortunately, yes, there was a study by Sullivan that showed when you spike cannabis flower with pesticides, so in a known amount, and then subject the material to heat, that the vast majority of that material gets into the smoke that people would inhale. So if the question is, are pesticides bad for inhalation? The answer is absolutely yes. In the paper, there are like 32 examples of things that were found in commercial cannabis in Washington State. And these are in government-approved, products. So it was extremely alarming. But without going through a litany of problems, pesticides can cause all kinds of problems, including seizures. They can be carcinogenic. They have effects on hormone levels. They're endocrine disruptors. So yeah, bad stuff. And basically it shouldn't be in cannabis. And this is why we advocate that pesticide testing be available on any product, cannabis product sold, and that information be available to the consumer. Heavy metals, lead, arsenic et al. these are concentrated by the cannabis plant if they are in the soil to begin with. So actually, hemp was planted at the Chernobyl facility as a bioremediation effort. So you can get it out of the soil. And then eventually you've got to then put that hemp somewhere where it's not going to leach it back into the groundwater. But heavy metals are very bad for humans and can produce mental retardation, death, all kinds of things, GI problems. So again, same thing. There should be heavy metal testing on products of cannabis that are sold for human consumption. What did we miss? Mycotoxins. These are a bigger issue for people that are immunosuppressed. When cannabis is properly grown, hopefully it's going to be healthy and not subject to having mold or fungal spores that could be an issue. And again, it's less likely if the material is immediately processed. And so like with the cryokeef, we think that this would be a safer way of producing material that would be free of these things. But again, it's the kind of thing that should be tested with that information available to the consumer.
Can you speak to how vaping or smoking impacts the lungs?
Yeah, well, we've got gradations. Smoking of anything is not good for you. I don't think it's a good approach to cannabis consumption, particularly for people who are sick. For people who have chronic conditions, we really emphasize oral preparations like oils or tinctures. And these are going to have advantages, not just in sparing the lungs, but also in having dosing lasting longer. So for many conditions like pain, if someone's using inhalation, they're typically going to need to smoke or vaporize every few hours. Whereas in treating with an oral agent, 2 or 3 times a day is often sufficient. So smoking, even though smoking of cannabis without tobacco is not associated with lung cancer, it does produce what are called polyaromatic hydrocarbons that are carcinogenic. And even if it doesn't cause cancer, you're taxing your liver to ask it to break down that stuff. So I don't recommend smoking. Vaporizing is better, but only if it's at a low temperature. So a lot of what so-called vaporization is done with units that produce red hot elements. They can introduce metal particles on their own. So low temperature vaporization with a good unit. In particular, I could recommend things made by Storz Bickel company in Europe. So they have the Volcano Vaporizer and the Mighty Medic. These are using hot air rather than direct exposure to heated metal elements. So those are safer. However, vaporization, again, can pose risks depending on what the starting material is. If we're talking about a high potency vape fluid, some of these contain 90% THC, and that is too much. THC needs to be accompanied by other components of cannabis that buffer its effects, particularly CBD, CBG, and terpenoids that help tame some of the drawbacks of THC. So I hope that covers it.
Yes, thank you. Our next question is about cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, also known as CHS. Have you ever heard of cholestasis or cholestatic liver being related to CHS? Also, have you heard of vitamin A being stored in the liver from cannabinoids and the possibility of vitamin A being a toxin?
Well, vitamin A is a toxin. Certainly you can, excuse me, excuse that interruption. Vitamin A is toxic in high doses. That's known from Arctic explorers. When they ate polar bear liver, they got very sick. And for some reason, that was concentrated in the polar bear liver. I'm not aware of cannabinoids having a specific relation there. I could be wrong. I just haven't heard that. Um, Relation of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome to cholestasis. When people present with CHS, which is a syndrome of severe nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and the interesting phenomenon of having symptoms relieved temporarily by exposure to hot water, baths, or showers. That condition is often mistaken for many other gastrointestinal issues. And unfortunately, there've probably been a lot of people out there who've had their gallbladders removed, thinking that it had something to do with their CHS symptoms. Part of this is a byproduct of modern medicine where a doctor doesn't have any time, and particularly not enough time to talk to the patient or gain their trust so they can get a good history. Now, it can work the other way too. We know of people who have gastrointestinal symptoms and go to the emergency room. And if one of the questions is, do you smoke cannabis? Whether it's related or not, they may get tagged with a CHS label. Full disclosure, we have a test, a genomic test, available that is a screening device. We have observed that there are 5 specific mutations in people with cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome that do not appear in high volume cannabis users who lack the symptoms. And again, there's an article on that in the library.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the biphasic activity of CBD, THC, and any other cannabinoids?
Sure. So the cannabinoids seem to have what's called a biphasic dose response curve. What this means in general is that the effects at a low dose can be opposite to what we see at a high dose. So everyone knows that THC at a low dose is good for nausea, and that was one of the first recognized indications in the West was using cannabis to counteract nausea associated with chemotherapy. The problem is at higher doses, it can produce nausea and vomiting, and this can happen to anyone. When it becomes a chronic condition due to chronic exposure to high THC concentrations, it can turn into cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome in susceptible individuals. And again, we believe that there's a genetic basis for that. So, the same thing can happen with cannabidiol. As mentioned previously, at low and moderate doses, pure cannabidiol is alerting. People mistake cannabidiol for being sedating because a lot of the early preparations from California had a great deal of myrcene in them as well as cannabidiol, and this created a misconception that CBD is sedating. But at very high doses, CBD can be sedating. And again, the most common context of that is when it's combined with other drugs that are sedatives, particularly anticonvulsants. So, I guess the advice is use the smallest amount that controls symptoms. Try to avoid situations of escalating dosages that are going to flip the effects to something else that may be undesirable.
Thank you. Let's talk about topical applications for the skin, such as acne, infections, anti-aging, psoriasis, eczema. Which ratios of THC and CBD have demonstrated the most therapeutic benefit?
Whew, okay, first about topicals in general. Cannabinoid treatment is great for the skin. Until recently, and I still will qualify this, the cannabinoids don't get through the skin very well at all. And so there are a lot of preparations out there that people use, but you can't treat a seizure disorder, for example, by applying cannabinoids on the skin. That's been proven. Uh, the thing I always hear, and this is amusing and requires some explanation, is people use pain preparations on the skin for a painful joint. And very, very frequently, they'll report instant relief, within a couple of minutes. Physiologically, this isn't possible because no material is going to get through the skin to the joint that fast. What may be happening is different, and it depends on the preparation. A lot of these things contain other stuff, particularly menthol. Menthol is a pain relieving agent with a local anesthetic effect and a cooling effect. So a lot of these preparations, if they're acting instantly, it may be because they're affecting what are called C fibers. These are nerve fibers in the skin that carry pain. Now, the bottom line is, if it helps reduce somebody's symptoms, we don't hate it. I'm not going to say it doesn't work. What works is what you feel works, but it may not be working for the reason that you're thinking. Now, I'm aware of some proprietary information I can't divulge right now on a new technique, a new carrier that seems really successful in getting this stuff through the skin. But again, watch this space. In terms of ratio of THC to CBD, it really depends on the condition. We know that THC is good for pain, it's good for itch. CBD is going to be more anti-inflammatory, less effective on pain. Yeah, it can have a role, but the two together. In general, and this may apply for skin, I think you're going to need higher proportions of CBD to THC to have an effect. Yeah, I don't have hard and fast rules on dosing. In a situation like acne, we do know that CBD has specific effects on acne, twofold. Number one, it has an antibiotic effect on Propionibacterium acnes, the bacterium that causes acne. It also acts through a mechanism called TRPV4 receptor that reduces sebum. That's the waxy material that is the feedstock for the P. acnes bacteria. CBD on its own may be effective in treating acne. You want an agent that isn't going to occlude the pores, however. Now, often these will contain alcohol to dissolve it. That may be irritating to the skin. So it's a place where some creativity in the vehicle is needed. And again, that's a spot where it's going to work on the skin. We're not really worried too much about absorption. So that's a great indication. With psoriasis, again, role for both THC and CBD. And, certainly terpenoids as adjuncts too.
I'm going to combine two questions. Can you speak to the current research on other cannabinoids beyond THC and CBD? And what are your thoughts on the new research opportunities from the recently signed federal research bill? And can you talk about what are some immediate short-term opportunities, whereas the low-hanging fruit, and long-term efforts for significant medical conditions?
Uh, on the new legislation, I'm skeptical. I don't see it changing very much, and that's really all I'm going to say. Until or unless cannabis is descheduled, um, it's going to remain extremely difficult. Not to mention funding opportunities. Uh, most biomedical research through the National Institutes of Health, that's a very ponderous process, takes a lot of time. It took me about 20 years to get my first NIH grant, but now I'm considered a good old boy, maybe not so good, but old. Um, uh, yeah. So then it falls upon industry to pick up the slack, and they've done a very poor job. To pick on Canada for a second, there are upwards of 260 licensed producers of cannabis in Canada. Most of them, in terms of the clinical research, have only done observational studies, meaning we'll give our preparation to this group of people with condition X and see how they like it. That can give you a signal, but it really isn't optimized. It's not a situation where either the preparation is the best it could be for the condition, and it certainly doesn't pass scientific scrutiny where the sine qua non of proof is the randomized controlled trial. Those are extremely expensive and usually are only going to be done in relation to pharmaceutical development. Additionally, both in Canada and the US, there are considerable roadblocks to research. Going to the question I like better on other components of cannabis, we talked a little bit about cannabichromene. We haven't talked yet about tetrahydrocannabivarin. So this is like THC, but it's got a 3-carbon side chain, a propyl group, instead of the pentyl 5-carbon of THC. Very unusual agent. It's found in very small amounts in cannabis varieties from Southern Africa. There are now various chemovars that have higher amounts, sometimes equal or exceeding the amount of THC. So THCV acts differently to THC. It is what's called a neutral antagonist at low doses. So it can reduce hunger. It's proven useful for metabolic syndrome, things that go along with pre-diabetic and diabetic conditions. It also has anticonvulsant and neuropathic pain treatment benefits. So we see it as a very promising agent, an up-and-comer. We've talked about CBG a fair amount. Beyond that, we need a lot more work on the acid cannabinoids. There are benefits there, everything from treating nausea to having a role in primary cancer treatment, also autoimmune conditions. So there's a lot more there. Keep in mind, there are 150 known cannabinoids from the plant at this point. We know something significant about the pharmacology of only about a dozen. We are really interested in finding and selectively breeding for cannabis that will produce some of these minor cannabinoids in higher amount, and they're subsequently testing them because every cannabinoid that's been found so far has unique medicinal properties, and there's no reason to think that it stops with the ones we've got now.
Have you ever heard of someone experiencing the side effect of dry eyes as a result of CBG use? And do you have any recommendations for how to counteract dry eyes?
Dry eyes is notoriously associated with THC. In CBG preparations, we have not seen this at all. That kind of thing, dry mouth, dry eyes, was reported by some of the patients in our 127 folks in the survey of CBG preparations, but not all of them were using pure CBG preparations. Um, so if someone has dry eyes to begin with and they want to use a cannabis-based medicine, I would say to minimize THC content and try and increase the amounts of CBD and CBG that don't have this as an associated adverse event.
What are your thoughts on the common uses of highly concentrated terpenes, such as those found in essential oils?
Well, these have to be treated with respect. These are not things that you ingest as is. Similarly, with the exception of lavender, they shouldn't be applied neat to the skin. In other words, straight out of the bottle. You can do that with lavender. In general, in skin preparations, you don't want to exceed a total terpenoid or essential oil content of 5%. Above that level, there can be toxicities with individual agents, particularly those that might become oxidized or with sun exposure. I'd be careful of limonene with sun exposure, for example. But those would be the general guidelines. So essential oils, for those who aren't familiar, are combinations of terpenoids as produced by plants, and they're extremely concentrated and merit use in tiny, tiny concentrations.
All right, so we have 43 remaining questions and 4 minutes
we have to do this again.
So I'm terribly sorry to all of you who have asked a question that we haven't been able to answer today, but we'll do this again in the future and hope that you guys will join us. Ethan, I didn't plant this one either. So how can CBN use to help treat insomnia?
It can't. There's a study, I didn't write this one, by Karun. It was in Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research, I guess it's a couple of years ago now. And it systematically looked at the evidence for cannabinol, an oxidative breakdown product of THC, in studies on insomnia. Now, let's back up. How did it happen that CBN became recommended for treatment of sleep disorders? Well, people may have had the experience of having old cannabis that was lying around at room temperature for a couple of years. And when they smoked it, they said, I didn't get high, and all it did was put me to sleep. There's a reason for that. Yeah, it had CBN in it. The reason the person was sleepy probably had more to do with sedating sesquiterpenoids that didn't break down in the plant, and particularly oxygenated ones that would happen with aging or exposure to light are very sedating. It's also possible that other funny things happened. The second reason that CBN has become associated with sleep products is because it's not THC. So what has happened in cannabis is there's been this huge overproduction of hemp with CBD as a byproduct and people needing to do something with it. So synthetically, they've transmogrified it into Delta-8 THC, or alternatively into making CBN from it. They're selling that. But it's shown very convincingly by Karun in this article that CBN, it's hard to show any benefit of it in treating sleep disturbance. So preparations that are helpful usually have other stuff in them. So they may have CBD again, that's going to reduce anxiety that interferes with sleep. They may have other things like linalool or other ingredients from other plants that may help with sleep, but we, at this point, can't recommend CBN as a sleep promoting agent. It's just not the evidence there.
All right, and the final thing that we'll address today is regarding tolerance. So someone is saying that they have a very high THC tolerance, and they've heard the only way to reduce that is to have a tolerance break, something we hear Dr. Dustin Sulak talk about. And they also ask a follow-up question: would using CBD ease with any withdrawal symptoms they might experience from THC?
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned part of the solution here. Dr. Dustin Sulak at healer.com has what he calls a resensitization procedure. So if someone is overly tolerant to THC or cannabis preparations, he starts them on a break just for 48 hours and finds that they can cut their dosage in half. And interestingly, if they're treating a medical condition, usually they're doing as well on treatment with half the dose. Could CBD help with withdrawal symptoms? Yeah, I mean, the fact that there are withdrawal symptoms indicates that somebody's been using too much THC. But the answer is yes. We also think there's quite a role for cannabigerol in that situation, treating withdrawal symptoms, particularly because it's such an effective agent in treating anxiety without being sedating itself.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for your attendance today. Please follow us on our social media, on LinkedIn and on Instagram. And we really appreciate the excellent questions that you've asked today. Ethan, any final words?
Thank you for attending, and happy holidays to everyone.
Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you.
Are we out?